Nella Boyd was 17 the autumn she watched her father set a whole year's cotton on Harlan Crook's scale and heard the beam settle on a number the whole line knew was a lie. Silas didn't argue. He signed the settle book and walked home still owing, and Silas was the man who read that scale for Crook, his own way-hand, forced to call false numbers against his neighbors. At the gin door, before 19 waiting families, Crook smiled. "The scale don't lie, Silas. Maybe your women can't pick clean." That night, Nella lifted the brass poise-weight off the beam, carried it to the county's certified stone, and wrote one quiet line to the state inspector. "If you believe quiet people read the fine print, this story is for you." Subscribe and comment what state you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. The lamp was low that night, the way it always was when the tally ran long. Nella Boyd sat at the kitchen table with a stub of pencil and her father's settle book open in front of her. She was 17. She had been figuring these numbers since she was 9. Since her hands could hold the pencil steady and her eyes could read the cramped lines in bad light. Outside, the cotton stood white in the September dark. 40 acres of it. Harlan Crook's 40 acres, picked clean by the Boyds for 11 years running. Nella ran the pencil down the column. She checked the pounds against the days. She checked the days against the mouths that had to eat while the cotton grew. Then she came to the bottom line, the settle line, and she sat with it a while. Owing, same as last year, same as the year before that. Her mother Odessa moved by the stove. She poured a little coffee that had been reheated too many times and set the cup down at Nella's elbow. She didn't say anything. She never said much when the book was open. She just put her hand on her daughter's shoulder for a moment, the weight of it warm and steady, and then took it away. "It comes out the same," Nella said. "It always does," Odessa said. "He picked as good as any man in the county. Better. I know it." "Then how do we owe?" Odessa didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer that helped. She went back to the stove, and Nella went back to the book, and the lamp burned down another quarter inch. Ardis County, Alabama, autumn of 1934. If you wanted to know how a family could work a full year, sun up to dark, and end it deeper in the hole than they started, you had to understand the scale. Everything went across the scale. Every pound of cotton the croppers picked came to Harlan Crook's gin, and it went on to Crook's platform, and Crook's beam settled at a number, and that number was the whole world. That number was whether you ate meat that winter. That number was whether the doctor came. That number was whether your boy got shoes or went barefoot into the cold. And the man who read that number, who called it out for Crook to write in the book, was Silas Boyd, Nella's father. That was the part that sat in her chest like a stone she'd swallowed. Her own father called the numbers. He stood at that scale on settle-up day, and he read the beam, and he said the figure aloud, and the figure was always short. 3 pounds. 5, 9 on a heavy bale. Every weighing, a little light. Never so much that any one man could point at it and say, "There, that's a theft." Just a little. Just enough. Silas didn't do it because he was a thief. Nella knew that the way she knew her own name. He did it because Crook owned the roof over their heads, and if Silas wouldn't call the numbers Crook wanted, some other man would. And the Boyds would be out in the road with the winter coming. So Silas read the beam and said the short figure and hated himself for it, and came home quiet, and Nella figured the true weight by lamplight and knew to the pound exactly how much had been stolen. She kept 2 tallies. One was the settle book, Crook's book, the lie. The other was hers, in a school copybook she hid under the loose board by the window. The true one. She had been keeping the true one for 4 years now. The next morning was settle up for the widow Tull. Nella wasn't supposed to be at the gin, but her father had left his reading glasses on the table, and a man couldn't read a beam without them. So she carried them down the rutted road in the gray light with the dew still on the weeds. The Tull place was the next farm over. Widow Tull worked it with one boy, 12 years old, and a mule so old its hips stood up like tent poles. That mule was the only thing between the Tulls and starving. It pulled their plow and it pulled their wagon, and it was worth more to them than gold. When Nella came up on the gin, they were already at the scale. Her father had another pair of glasses, an old cracked pair he kept in his coat, so he hadn't needed hers after all. She stood back at the edge of the yard and watched. The Widow Tool's cotton went onto the platform. Silas read the beam. He called a number, and it was low. Nella heard it and knew it was low. But that wasn't the theft that morning. The theft that morning was in the book. Crook stood at his high desk with the ledger open and his pen in his hand, and he ran his finger down the Widow Tool's account, and he said, in that flat voice of his, "You're short, Ms. Tool. Balance carried from last year, and interest on the seed, and the doctor bill from when your boy took sick. Comes to more than your cotton makes." "That can't be right," the widow said. Her voice was thin. "I paid the doctor. I paid him in eggs, all summer." "Not in my book," Crook said. Nella watched him write. She was close enough, at that angle, to see the page. And she saw him add a figure that had no business being there, a line he set down fresh with his own pen, and she understood then that the book itself was doctored, not just the scale. The scale stole the cotton. The book stole everything else. "I'll need the mule," Crook said, "against the balance." The Widow Tool made a sound. Her boy, standing beside her, went white and grabbed at the mule's halter like he could hold the whole world in place with his two hands. But there was nothing to hold. Silas looked at the ground. And the mule was led away to Crook's barn, and the Tulls walked home with nothing. And only 3 people in the county knew the balance had been invented out of ink and air: Nella and the boy, and Crook himself. Nella didn't give her father his glasses. She turned around and carried them home and put them back on the table, and she took out the copybook from under the loose board, and she wrote down what she'd seen. The true weight of the Widow Tool's cotton. And beside it, in a smaller hand, one word: mule. 2 days after that, she went to the store. The county store was Crook's too, of course. Everything was Crook's. You bought your flour and your coffee and your cloth on credit against next year's cotton. And the credit had interest, and the interest was another way the ledger ate you. Nella went for a spool of thread and a sack of meal, and she stood at the counter while the storekeeper, a stooped man named Pruitt, who was Crook's man but not, she thought, all the way Crook's man, weighed out the meal. And she saw the weight on the counter. She'd seen it 100 times and never once looked at it. A block of iron, dull and gray, bolted down to the wood at the end of the counter. There was a little brass plate on it, and Nella leaned in and read the plate while Pruitt was tying off her sack. State of Alabama. Certified Standard. She read the pounds it stood for. And underneath, worn but readable, for the use of any customer to check a purchase. She stood looking at it. A true weight. A weight the state itself said was true, sealed and certified, bolted to the counter so that any soul who thought they'd been cheated could set their goods against it and see. And tacked to the wall beside it, yellowed and curled at the edges, was a circular. A single sheet, the kind they printed and sent out with feed sacks and seed catalogs. Nella read it because she read everything. Because reading was the one thing they couldn't put a short weight on. The circular was from the State Office of Weights and Measures. It said that any scale used in trade, any scale a man's living passed across, was subject to test. And it said, in plain print, that any citizen of the county could file a written complaint and summon the county sealer of weights to test that scale, and the sealer was bound by law to do it. Any citizen. On written complaint. Nella read it twice. Then she read it a third time, and this time she read it the way she read her father's tally, memorizing the shape of it, the exact words. Because she didn't have a pencil and paper and she wasn't going to ask Pruitt for one, she read it until she had it. Then she folded her thoughts up small the way she folded the true tally under the board, and she paid for her meal and thread, and she walked home. She didn't have a plan yet. She had a feeling, low down, the way you feel weather coming before you see the clouds. That was all. The settle-up for the Boyds themselves came the following week. Silas had picked his 40 acres. Nella had figured it, every pound by lamplight, against the picking days and the wagon loads. She knew, before her father ever set foot on Crook's yard, exactly what the true weight was, and exactly what it should mean at settle. By her true book, the Boyds should have come out even. Not ahead. They never came out ahead, but even. Clear, a whole year's work worth exactly the roof and the food it took to do the work. That was the honest number. She walked down to the gin with her father because she couldn't help it. She stood at the back of the yard. Silas set his own cotton on Crook's platform. He read his own beam. And Nella watched her father call a number 3 pounds light on the last bale against his own family. Because the other man who'd call the numbers if he didn't was standing right there in the yard, a young fellow named Ardis who wanted the Wayhands' place and the Wayhands' small wage, and Silas Boyd knew it. Then Crook ran the book. "Comes up owing," Silas, Crook said. Same flat voice he'd used on the widow. Weight of about a bale short of clear. A bale. One missed bale. Just enough to keep them under, to carry the debt forward into a 12th year, to make sure the Boyds started the next spring already behind. Silas signed the settle book. He didn't argue. He never argued. He took the pen and he wrote his name under the lie, and Nella watched her father's hand, a good hand, a strong hand, sign the family into another year of Harlan Crook's pocket. Then he set the pen down and he walked out of the yard past his own daughter without looking at her, because he couldn't. Nella went home and got out the copybook. She wrote the true weight. She wrote the true settle. And beside the false owing figure Crook had entered, she wrote the difference, and she underlined it once. She thought that was the worst it would be. She thought private theft, the quiet kind that happened in a book at a high desk, was the whole shape of it. She was wrong. The worst came at the gin door, in front of everybody. It was the big settle-up day, the one where near all the county came, 19 families with their trucks and their wagons lined up along the road, waiting their turn at the scale, cotton heaped and covered in the beds. A whole year of Ardis County's work, waiting to cross Harlan Crook's platform. The air smelled of cotton lint and dust and mule. Children sat on tailgates. The men stood in a loose line with their hats in their hands, quiet. The way men get quiet when their whole year comes down to a number they can't see and can't argue. Crook stood at the gin door up on the loading step, high above them, with his book. He liked the height. He liked to look down. The families came one at a time. Cotton onto the platform. Silas at the beam, calling numbers, each one a little light. Crook at the book, figuring, and family after family came up owing, or barely clear. Or clear by so little it was an insult. And nobody said anything, because what could you say? The scale was the scale, the beam was the beam. Then it was Silas's own turn, his own cotton went up. And maybe that was the thing that broke something loose in Crook, that even the Wayhand had to bring his cotton to the same scale, that even his own man was under him. Because when Silas read his beam low, against himself, and the figure came up short, Crook looked down from the loading step at Silas Boyd in front of the whole county, and he smiled, and he said it loud enough for all 19 families to hear. The scale don't lie, Silas, the yard went still. Maybe your women can't pick clean. Nella was standing at the edge of the crowd. She felt the words hit her father like a hand across the face. She saw Silas's jaw work, once, and then go flat and still. And she saw him do the only thing an 11-year Wayhand with a family and no other roof could do. He said nothing. He looked at the beam. He kept his face like a stone. But Nella looked at the crowd. And she saw 19 families hear that a man's honest women, her mother, her, couldn't pick clean, when every soul in that yard knew the Boyds picked as clean as any family in the county and cleaner than most. She saw the shame land, and she saw it land not just on her father, but on all of them. Because if the scale could shame the Wayhand's own family with a smile, it could shame anyone, and there was nothing any of them could do. That was the moment it stopped being a feeling low down like weather. That was the moment it became a thing she was going to do. She didn't know it fully yet. standing there in the dust with her fists closed at her sides. But something in her had settled, the way a beam settles, onto a true number at last. She waited until the yard emptied and the trucks pulled out one by one down the road, and the light went long and gold, and then gray. She waited until her father had walked home ahead of her, slow, his shoulders down. She waited until the gin was dark and Crook had gone up to his house on the hill and there was no one at the scale. Then Nella Boyd walked back to the gin in the dusk, and she climbed up onto the platform, and she reached up to the beam. There was a weight that rode the beam. A brass poise, the sliding weight that a man moved along the arm to balance the load. The very thing her father slid and read 100 times a day. Nella had watched her father's hand on it since she was a child. She knew it the way she knew the pencil. She lifted it off. It came away heavy and cool in her palm, dull yellow brass, worn smooth on top from 1,000 thumbs. She stood there holding it, and her heart was going hard. Because taking it was a thing you couldn't take back. But she'd already decided, up in the yard when Crook smiled. She just hadn't known yet what her hands were going to do about it. She carried the poise down off the platform, and she walked, in the near dark, all the way to the store. Pruitt was closing up. He had the lamp still lit inside, and he was counting the till. And when Nella knocked on the glass he came and let her in, frowning, but he let her in, because he was Crook's man but not all the way Crook's man, and because she was just a girl with something in her hand. "We're closed, Nella, I know it. I just want to weigh something." "On the true weight." "Just a minute." He looked at her a long moment. Then he stepped back and let her come to the counter, to the certified standard bolted to the wood, the state's own true iron. Nella set the brass poise on the store's counter scale, the little balance scale Pruitt used for weighing out sugar and meal, the one you could set against the certified standard to know it read honest. She had figured, at the table by lamplight while she waited for dark, exactly what a poise-weight for that beam ought to weigh. She knew the beam. She knew the scale, she knew the pounds it was made to read, and from that she knew, near enough, what the true poise should weigh to make that beam read true. She balanced the poise against the certified iron, and she read it. It was light. The poise itself was short, filed down, or cast light, or ground away underneath where no man sliding it along a beam 100 times a day would ever think to look. The very weight her father slid and read from, the weight the whole county's cotton was measured against, the weight that decided who ate meat and who went barefoot, was itself a lie. Every load that crossed that scale crossed it against a short weight, and so every load read light, and the difference, 3 pounds, 5, 9, went into Harlan Crook's ledger season after season, family after family, for years. She had it now. Not a feeling, not a suspicion. A fact she could hold in her hand, cool and yellow and heavy wrong. Pruitt was watching her face. "What is that?" he said. "Lo, it's the poise off the gin scale," Nella said. Her own voice sounded far away to her. "And it's light. It's short. Set it against your certified iron and see for yourself." He didn't touch it. He looked at it a long time. The storekeeper who was Crook's man but not all the way. Then he looked at her, and something moved in his face, some old thing, some long-swallowed thing. "You put that back," he said quietly, "before he misses it." "I will." "You put it back tonight, girl. He counts on that scale. He'll look." "I said I will." But she stood a moment longer with the poise in her hand, and she looked at the yellowed circular she'd read a week ago. The one tacked by the certified iron, the state's own words. Any citizen. On written complaint. The county sealer, bound by law to come and test. And she asked Pruitt, careful, like it was nothing, this circular here. "Is it still good? The law it talks about?" Pruitt followed her eyes to the wall. He was quiet a while. "It's good," he said. "Law don't rot on a wall. Sealer's a county man. Deputy, they call him. Alton Reese. Got an office at the courthouse he sets in maybe twice a month." He paused. Nobody's ever called him out here. Not once in my time. Folks don't know they can. Or they know, and they know whose gin it is, and they'd sooner starve quiet. Nella looked at the poise in her hand, and she looked at the circular, and in her mind she laid the two together the way she laid the false tally against the true one. The short weight in her hand was the theft. The words on the wall were the door. She took the poise and she walked back through the dark to the gin, and she climbed the platform. And she set it back on the beam exactly where it rode, dull and yellow and wrong, and no man would know it had ever been gone. Then she walked home under a sky gone thick with stars, and she didn't sleep. The next morning she copied the circular. She went back to the store early, before the road filled, and she stood at the counter with the school copybook and her pencil stub. And she wrote out the state's words letter for letter, exactly the way the circular had them. The right of any citizen, the written complaint, the sealer bound by law. She got every word. Pruitt watched her do it and didn't stop her, and when she was done he weighed her out a nickel's meal she hadn't asked for and wouldn't take money for. Which was the closest a man like Pruitt could come to saying a thing out loud. Then Nella went home and sat at the table with the true tally on one side and the copied law on the other, and she began, slow and careful, in her best hand, to write a letter to the county sealer of weights, Deputy Alton Reese, at the courthouse in Ardis County. She told him plain that she believed the platform scale at Crook's Gin, a scale used in trade, wanted testing. She told him she was a citizen of the county and she was filing complaint under the law he was bound by, and she wrote out the law she was filing under, word for word off the wall. She signed it with her own name. Not her father's. Her own. Nella Boyd. She did not tell him about the poise. Not yet. She had a feeling, low down like weather again, that if she said too much in a letter, the letter might not travel true. Some letters got read by hands they weren't meant for. She said only enough to arm the law and no more. Let the sealer find the short weight himself, with his own certified iron. Let it be the state's finding, not a girl's accusation. She sealed it. She would carry it to the courthouse herself. But there was one more thing she meant to do, and it was the thing that would make everything after it clean, though she couldn't have said that word for it. She only knew, the way she knew figures, that a thing done in the open is stronger than a thing done in the dark. She wrote a second note, short, plain, and she carried it down to the store. And in front of Pruitt, so there'd be a witness, so it couldn't ever be said she'd sneaked, she asked Pruitt to see that Harlan Crook got it. She read it out loud so Pruitt heard every word. Sir, I believe your scale wants testing before settle-up ends. I've asked the county to look. Pruitt's hand shook a little taking it. Girl, he said. You know what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing, Nella said. I've done the figures. She left the note in Pruitt's hand, witnessed, dated, plain, a warning given fair, in the open. If Harlan Crook wanted to laugh at it, he could laugh at it. But he could never say he wasn't told. She walked out of the store into the hard autumn light with the sealed letter to the courthouse still in her apron pocket, and the true tally under the board at home, and 11 years of short weights added up in her head to a number she finally knew what to do with. Behind her, in the storekeeper's shaking hand, was a folded plain note that would soon be sitting on Harlan Crook's high desk. And up on the hill, in his house, Crook didn't know yet that a 17-year-old girl who kept her father's tally by lamplight had already read the one thing on his walls he'd never bothered to read himself. She didn't know what he'd do when he read it. She only knew she'd told him true, and that the county man, the one nobody had ever called, was about to get a letter with her name on the line. Harlan Crook read the note at his high desk that same afternoon, and he laughed. Pruitt watched him do it. The old man held the folded paper up to the window light, read the one line twice, and let out a sound like a cough that had given up being a cough. Then he laid it flat on the desk and smoothed it with the side of his hand. The Boyd girl, he said. Silas's girl. Yes, sir, wrote this. She read it to me first, out loud, wanted me to hear it. Crook smiled. It was not a kind thing to see. She wants my scale tested. That scale was certified. I paid the man myself. He folded the note back along its creases, careful. Like a man putting away a thing he might want to laugh at again later. You tell her, if you see her, that settle-up ends Saturday. Same as always. She can bring the county, she can bring the governor. My scale don't lie. Pruitt said nothing. He had a certain thing he knew now, and he kept it behind his teeth, because a man who kept a store in Ardis County learned early which things were his to say and which were not. But he'd seen the girl set that brass poise on his own certified stone. He'd seen the beam tip. He knew what Crook didn't know he didn't know. And he thought, walking back to his counter, that he had never in his life watched a man laugh so hard at a rope already around his neck. So Crook posted the settle-up. Saturday, at the gin. Final numbers, all accounts closed for the season. He nailed it to the store wall himself, right next to the yellowed circular Nella had read, and he never once looked at the circular, because why would he? Words on a wall. He'd sold cotton off that scale for 30 years. Nella walked to the courthouse that Monday. It was 11 miles. She went on foot in the early cold, her good shoes in her hand to save the leather, and she put them on in the ditch outside town so she'd walk in decent. The courthouse was a square brick building with a clock that had stopped, and inside it smelled of floor oil and old paper. She asked a man where the county sealer of weights kept his office, and the man looked at her a while before he answered, because nobody ever asked that. Deputy Alton Reese had a small room at the end of the hall. He was younger than she'd pictured, with a felt-lined case on his desk and a look on his face like a man who'd been left alone with his tools so long he'd stopped expecting company. She stood in his doorway with her sealed letter in her hand. "You the sealer of weights?" "I am. I've come to file a complaint." "In writing. Against a scale used in trade." She said it the way the circular said it, word for word, because she'd copied it word for word. Harlan Crook's platform scale at his gin. I believe it reads short. I want it tested before he closes his books. Reese looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the letter. Then he did a thing she hadn't expected. He stood up, and he took the letter from her with both hands. The way a man takes a thing he's been waiting on without knowing it. "Sit down," he said. "You'll want to sign the register. It's the law that I go when I'm called. Nobody's called on the Crook gin before." "I know," Nella said. "That's why I walked." He read her complaint. She'd written it clean, dates and all, and at the bottom she'd put her own name, not her father's. Nella Boyd. Reese noticed that. She saw him notice it. "You understand," he said. "If I test that beam and it's true, you'll have made an enemy for nothing. It won't be true. You sound sure." "I've done the figures," she said. 11 years of them. Reese signed his own name under hers and dated it and put the letter in a drawer that locked. "Saturday," he said. "I'll be there before he opens the platform. A complaint's a complaint. The county pays my travel." He almost smiled. First time it ever has. She walked the 11 miles home and got in after dark, and her mother had kept a plate warm, and Odessa didn't ask where she'd been. Only looked at her daughter's face and set the plate down and pressed her hand flat against Nella's cheek for a second. The way she did when there was nothing to be said that would help, and everything to be felt. Now came the hard part, which was waiting, and acting like there was nothing to wait for. There was a way that Wednesday. A small one, some late pickings. The Boyds went as always. Silas set his sack on the platform and Crook stood at the beam and slid the poise, and Nella watched her father's hands, and she watched Crook's, and she kept her face as flat as a swept floor. And Crook, sliding the poise back to 0 after, stopped. His finger stayed on the brass a moment. He turned it over. He was a man who'd handled that weight 10,000 times. And something in the balance of it, some ghost of a thing, made him pause. "This poise been off the beam?" he said to nobody, to the yard. Nella's heart went sideways in her chest. But her mouth was already moving, easy, before her fear could reach it. Deputy Reese was in the store Monday, she said, measuring seed corn against the county stone. Pruitt had all sorts of things up on that counter. Maybe he set it down there. She said it like a girl saying nothing much, a girl making conversation to fill the cold, and she even looked bored saying it, which cost her more than anything she'd done that whole autumn. Crook grunted. Seed corn. The county stone. It made a kind of sense to a man who wasn't looking for a knife. He set the poise back on its beam and thought no more of it. And Nella breathed out slow through her nose and did not let her hands shake until she was in the truck with them tucked under her arms. That was the first near thing. There was a second. Friday evening, the night before settle-up, Crook sent word down the row that he wanted Silas at the gin. Private, just the two of them. Nella wanted to go and knew she couldn't. She sat in the house and figured sums she already knew the answer to, just to have something for her hands, while her father walked up the hill in the dark. Crook had a bottle out and 2 glasses, which he'd never once done in 11 years, and that alone told Silas everything. The old man poured and pushed a glass across the desk and talked around it for a while, the weather, the price of cotton. The way the young men these days didn't know work. Then he came to it. I've been thinking, Silas, you've called my scale straight and steady all these years. A man like that ought to see something for it. He tapped the ledger on his desk. I'm going to close the books tomorrow. Old numbers. Same as we always figure, and I'm going to put a little something extra to the Boyd account. Call it a bonus. Wipe out that owing you carried this year. Clean, what do you say? There it was. A bonus to bless the old numbers. Silence bought at the price of a debt Crook had invented in the first place. Silas looked at the glass he hadn't touched. He looked at the ledger with his neighbor's stolen weight written in it in his own careful hand. And something that had been bent in him for 11 years, bent so long he'd forgotten it had ever been straight, came up straight. No, Silas said. Crook waited for more. There wasn't any more coming. And that unsettled him worse than a speech would have. No? I called your numbers 11 years, Silas said. I don't believe I'll call one more. He set the untouched glass back on the desk, and he stood, and he put his hat on in Crook's own office, which was a thing a Wayhan did not do, and he walked out into the dark and down the hill to his own house, and he did not look back at the light in Crook's window. He told Nella none of it that night. But she saw his face when he came in, and she saw that he stood different, and she knew. She got up and put the kettle on, though it was late, and the two of them sat at the table with coffee neither of them needed, and after a while Silas said, "Whatever comes tomorrow, girl. Whatever comes. You did right." And that was all. It was enough. She'd carried the weight of it alone so long she'd forgotten there was anybody who could help her carry it, and now her father had put his hand under the other end. Deputy Reese, that same week, had done a thing of his own that mattered, though the Boyds didn't know it yet. He'd pulled the certification file on the Crook gin scale. And what he found, he'd have explained to anyone who asked, was simple enough that it ought to have been common knowledge and never was. A public scale had to be sealed by the county, tested and stamped every year. Crook's tag read 1929. 5 years void. And the law was plain as a fence post. On a filed complaint, the sealer could test any scale used in trade. And if the beam or the poise proved false, every settlement figured on that scale was void back through the season. Not just the last weighing. The whole season. Every doctored number, every phantom balance, every mule taken and page added, all of it undone, and restitution owed by the man who'd worked the crooked scale. Reese had never once got to use that law. He oiled his sealed standards Friday night the way another man might have cleaned a gun. Saturday came up cold and bright. Crook, though, had gotten wind. A man in the courthouse who owed him a favor had let slip that the sealer was riding out to the Crook gin at first light. And Crook, who'd laughed at a girl's note all week, stopped laughing sometime in the small hours of that morning. And did a frightened man's arithmetic. He went to the gin before dawn. He meant to swap the filed poise for a true one he kept in the office, and he meant to feed the doctored ledger into the boiler and figure the settle from a clean second book he could write fresh. Simple. A man covers his tracks. He climbed to the platform in the gray light with a true brass poise in his coat pocket and reached for the one on the beam. It was gone. The filed poise was not on the beam. Crook stood there in the cold with his hand out over the empty saddle of the beam and his breath smoking, and he could not for the life of him make it be there. He'd have swapped it in a heartbeat, and no man the wiser. But you cannot swap a thing that's already gone. Somebody had lifted it. And if it was gone, where was it? And who had it? And what did they mean to do with it? Morning, Mr. Crook, Silas, and Nella came across the yard in the dawn, early, the way honest people come who have nothing to hide from the light. Behind them, already, the first trucks were turning in off the road. The Cropper families rolling up for settle-up, more of them than usual, because word travels a cotton row faster than any road. Crook shoved his own true poise back in his pocket and came down off the platform. And then a horse and a small county wagon turned in at the gate, and Deputy Alton Reese climbed down with a felt-lined case in his two hands. And Harlan Crook's whole Saturday came apart at the seams. By 8 o'clock the yard was full. 19 families, near enough, the trucks nosed in a ragged line, and the people standing out of them in their Saturday clothes, because settle-up was the one day of the year you wore them. They'd come for their numbers. They didn't know yet they'd come for more than that. There was a low murmur going through them, the way there is when something's wrong and nobody can say what, and every eye kept sliding to the county man kneeling at Crook's platform scale with a case of brass open on the boards beside him. "Now hold on," Crook said. He'd found his voice. He came out into the middle of the yard with his hands spread, big and easy. The landlord's voice he used on rent day. "Alton, I don't know what somebody's told you, but that scale's been certified. I got the tag right there on the housing. No cause to keep these folks waiting on their money." "Complaint was filed," Reese said. He didn't look up. He was lifting the sealed standards out of the felt one at a time and laying them in a row on the platform, each one stamped with the county seal, each one true. "Filed in writing, under the statute. I'm bound to test. You can watch same as anybody." "Filed by who?" Reese looked up then. He looked past Crook to the girl standing quiet beside her father at the edge of the yard. He didn't point. He didn't have to. Crook turned, and the whole yard turned with him, and there was Nella Boyd, 17 years old, in her one good dress with her chin level. Crook laughed. It came out wrong this time. Thin. Her? "Silas, you let your girl—" "Let's test the scale," Reese said. He set the first standard on the platform. 50 pounds, sealed, certified, true as the county could make it. He slid the beam poise, his own, not Crook's, out along the notches, and the beam did not come level at 50. It hung. He touched it lower. It came level, at last, well short of the mark. Reese stood up. He wiped his hands on his trousers, unhurried, and he said it plain. So the whole yard heard it, not loud. Just clear. 7 pounds short, he said. On every 50. Has been all season. The yard went dead still. Then a sound moved through it, low, from the back, the sound 19 families make when a thing they've felt in their bones for years is suddenly, finally, said out loud by a man with a badge and a case of sealed brass. Somebody said, "God Almighty." A woman started crying without any noise. 7 pounds on 50. Every one of them ran the sum in their heads and got the same terrible number. The number of what they'd carried, the coats and the doctors and the school years, all of it, weighed out short by the crooked pound. Autumn after autumn. Crook's face had gone the color of tallow. But he was not a man to fall on the first blow. He drew himself up and jabbed a finger at the housing of his scale. "That tag's certified. 19 and 29. Paid for it myself." "You can't stand there in 29, Reese said. "That's right." He walked to the housing and put his thumb under the yellowed tag and turned it up for the yard to see. "A public scale seals every year." This tag's 5 years dead. This scale hasn't been legal to weigh cotton since Herbert Hoover was president. He let that sit. Every settle-up figured on it is void. Back through the season. That's the law, Harlan. It's been the law the whole time. That was the first fall, and Crook felt it go under him. He turned, the way a landed fish turns, looking for water, and he found Silas. Silas, you worked this scale. You called these numbers. You stand there and tell this man his standards are off. Tell him, you know this scale. And Silas Boyd, who had bent for 11 years, who had called false numbers against his neighbors because the alternative was his family in the road, looked his landlord in the eye in front of the whole county and said the truest thing he had ever said. I called your numbers 11 years, Mr. Crook. His voice didn't shake. I won't call one more. That was the second fall. It was quiet, but the yard heard every word of it, and a thing shifted in the way the people stood. Because the way hand had turned, and if the way hand had turned there was no going back to how things were. Crook wheeled toward the gin office. My ledger'll show, my book's got every figure. I'll prove these accounts are square. He came out with the ledger clutched to his chest like a shield, and he slapped it open on the platform. Right here. Signed. Every man's mark. It's all short, Nella said. It was the first she'd spoken. The yard turned to her. She came forward, and out of her apron she took a school copybook. Worn soft at the corners, filled edge to edge in a small, clear hand. The true tally, kept by lamplight, 11 years of it, every weighing her father had ever called, and the pounds it should have been. She laid it on the platform beside Crook's ledger, open, so the two books lay side by side in the cold light. Same weighings, she said to Reese, not to Crook. His book and mine. Only mine's got the honest figure next to the called one. Every time. You can lay them together and read the difference straight down the page. She put her finger on the first line. Widow Tull. September, called at 300. Weighed at 351. 51 pounds, that one weighing. And the mule he took for a balance she never owed. Reese bent over the two books. He was quiet a long while, his finger moving down one page and then the other. Then he straightened and looked at Crook, and there was nothing friendly left in his face at all. She's right, he said. It reads straight down, your own book against a true one. Crook's mouth worked. That girl could have wrote anything in that copybook. Anybody could, and that was when Pruitt stepped out of the crowd. The storekeeper had come with the rest and stood at the back, and nobody had marked him. Now he came forward into the open, turning his hat in his hands, and he said, She warned you, Harlan. He said it to Crook, but loud enough for the yard. Monday last, she wrote you a note said your scale wanted testing before settle up. She read it to me out loud first, so there'd be a witness. Dated, plain. I put it in your hand myself. He swallowed. And you laughed. I stood there and watched you laugh at it. That was the third fall, and it was the one that took his feet out from under him. Because it was the one that made him not just wrong, but knowing. He'd been told. In writing. In the open. And he'd laughed. There is no telling of that story where the man who laughed comes out clean. Reese knelt one last time at the scale. From his case he took a length of sealed wire and a lead tag stamped condemned, and he threaded the wire through the beam and through the housing and drew it tight and crimped the lead onto it. So the scale could not be worked again without breaking a county seal. He stood, and he brushed off his knees, and he said to the yard, This scale's condemned. Won't weigh a pound of anything till it's tested true and sealed fresh, and it'll be a while before this county trusts him to. Every settle figured on it this season is void. He picked up Nella's copybook and held it, gentle, like a thing that mattered. We'll refigure. Every account, off the honest tally, weighing by weighing, and the county'll file for what's owed back to every family here. Then he did the thing they would all remember. He read the names. He stood on Harlan Crook's own platform with the condemned seal swinging from the beam. And he read the accounts aloud, one family at a time, off Nella's lamplight figures, and he called out the true weight and the called weight and the difference, name by name, out loud, in front of them all. Widow Tull. The old woman came forward, her boy beside her. Owed nothing. Owed nothing this whole season and last. Your mule's to come back to you today. And two men were already leading it across the yard, the same mule, and the widow put her face against its neck and didn't lift it for a long time. He read the Dease account, and the Pruitt kin, and family after family, and each one got its beat, each one heard its own true number, called into the cold air where all their neighbors could hear it. And there was a woman who laughed, and a man who put his hat over his face, and the schoolboy's father, the man whose 12-year-old had been pulled from his lessons to work off pounds that never existed. That man walked up to Crook's open ledger and, at Reese's nod, took the corner of the owed page in his fingers and tore it clean out of the book. And stood there holding it, breathing hard, a torn page in his fist, and nobody said a word to stop him. Reese came to the last name. Boyd. Silas stood straight. Nella stood beside him. 11 years, Reese said, reading it down. Every one of them short. Every one of them owing when they should have been clear. He looked up. Refigured honest, off your own book you don't owe Harlan Crook a nickel, he owes you. First time in 11 years, Silas, you closed the season in the black. The yard was quiet the way a church is quiet. And then the hats came off. Not a roar, not a crowd's noise, that wasn't the kind of morning it was. Just, all across the yard, men taking their hats off and turning, one after another, toward a 17-year-old girl who'd read the one thing on the wall nobody else had bothered to read. Nella Boyd stood in her one good dress with her father's arm come around her shoulders. And she didn't cry, and she didn't smile much, because she'd known all along what the figures said. She'd only had to wait for everybody else to get to look. Harlan Crook said something then. Nobody quite caught it. It didn't land. He said something about the certification and something about lawyers. And his voice went out into that quiet yard and just fell, the way a thing falls that has no floor under it anymore. The county clerk who'd ridden out with Reese read the restitution order in a flat courthouse voice, and Crook stood and listened to the size of what he owed, and there was nothing in him left to laugh with. He walked up the hill to his house, alone, and the yard let him go, and turned back to the business of true numbers. Spring came on soft that next year. There was a piece of rented bottomland down along the creek, good black dirt, that the Boyds worked now for themselves, and a few acres more that the families worked together. Odessa's wash hung white on the line in the April wind, snapping like small flags, and there was coffee on the porch in the cool of the morning and time, for once, to drink it. They'd put up a scale of their own. A growers' co-op. The 19 families had made it through the winter, all of them together, so no one man held the beam over another one ever again. And Silas Boyd read that scale. He read it honest, sealed fresh with the county stamp, and men came from 3 counties over to weigh with him because a weigh hand who'd told the truth in front of the whole world was a weigh hand you could trust with your cotton in the dark. Nella sat on the co-op steps most weigh days with her copybook, and beside her sat the Tull boy, 12 years old and back in school now. And she taught him to figure a settle, how the poise slides, how the beam hangs true, how you carry the pounds down the page, and where a man might hide a lie if you weren't watching. The figures don't care who you are, she told him. That's the whole beauty of them. Learn the figures and nobody weighs you short again. Word came, along toward summer, that Crook was selling the gin. He had to cover what he owed, and he couldn't find a weigh hand who'd stand at his beam anyway. No man in the county would call numbers for Harlan Crook now, not for double wages. There'd been a note, once in the winter. It came to the Boyd house in Crook's own hand, asking Silas to come back and read for him again, at better wages than before. Silas hadn't opened it. He'd turned it over, looked at the name, and handed it back to the boy who'd carried it. Tell him no, he'd said, and that was all, and he'd gone back to his coffee. Nella hung wash with her mother in the spring light and thought sometimes about how close it had come to never happening. A circular tacked to a wall. A certified stone bolted to a counter. Words that any of them could have read for 30 years and never did. Because they'd been taught, careful, that reading them wasn't for the likes of them. That was the lie under the lie. The scale was only the machine of it. The real theft was letting them believe they weren't allowed to look. She said it out loud once, to the toll boy, on a slow weigh day. And he wrote it in the back of his own new copybook because it sounded like a thing worth keeping. A scale only lies as long as nobody's allowed to look. That's the whole of it. That's how a 17-year-old girl with a copybook and a long walk to the courthouse broke a man who owned a county. She didn't shout. She didn't burn anything down. She just read the fine print out loud, in the open, in front of everybody, and made them let her look. If a story like this ought to be heard, tell somebody. And comment the name of your town, wherever you're listening from. I'd like to know how far this one travels.